My sister died 5 years ago, but yesterday I received a letter from her in the mail. The date, yesterday's. Inside was one phrase: I'm alive. Don't trust your husband. He knows. When I showed him the letter, his face. Welcome back, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I had a good life. Not perfect. Nobody's life is perfect, but good enough that I stopped questioning it. Daniel and I had been married for 11 years. We lived in a gray and white colonial house in Ashford, Connecticut, the kind of town where people wave to each other from their driveways. And the worst thing that happens on a Tuesday is a fender bender in the grocery store parking lot. I taught 8th grade English at the local middle school. Daniel ran his own small contracting business. We had a dog named Pepper, a shared Netflix password, and a Sunday routine that involved farmers market coffee and the crossword puzzle. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and I loved it. The one wound I carried quietly, the one that never fully closed, was Claire, my younger sister, 29 years old when she died, or when we were told she died, in a hiking accident in Washington state. She had gone alone, which wasn't unusual for Claire. She was that kind of woman, restless, independent, always chasing something the rest of us couldn't quite see. They found her car at the trailhead. They found her jacket snagged on a branch near the ridge. They never found her body. The official ruling, after several weeks of searching, was accidental death. Presumed, that word, presumed, had lived in my chest like a splinter for 5 years. The grief had changed shape over time. In the first year, it was raw and loud. By the 3rd year, it had gone quiet, the way old grief does. I kept a photo of Claire on my desk at school, her laughing at a barbecue, sunburned and squinting. And sometimes my students would ask who she was, and I would say, my sister, and leave it at that. Daniel had been kind during those years, attentive even. He had driven me to Washington for the memorial. He had held my hand at the service. He had never rushed me through the mourning, never told me to move on. I gave him credit for that. I gave him a lot of credit, actually, for a lot of things I probably should have examined more closely. It was a Wednesday in October when the letter arrived. I remember the day clearly because I had stayed home with a head cold, which meant I was the one who walked to the mailbox at 11 in the morning in my bathrobe and slippers. Bills, a catalog, a card from my aunt in Phoenix, and then, at the bottom of the stack, a plain white envelope with no return address. My name was written by hand, Mara Collins. The handwriting stopped me before I even registered why. I stood at the end of the driveway in the October cold, and I stared at those letters, and something in my body understood before my brain did. It was Claire's handwriting. I told myself I was wrong. I told myself that grief does strange things to the mind, that 5 years of carrying a ghost can make you see her everywhere. I turned the envelope over. The postmark was from Portland, Oregon. The date was yesterday's. I went inside. I sat down at the kitchen table. I opened it. Inside was a single index card. No greeting, no signature. 7 words, printed in blue ink in her careful, slightly slanted hand. I'm alive. Don't trust your husband. He knows. I read it 4 times. 5. My coffee went cold beside me. Outside, a car passed. The dog scratched at the back door to come in. The world continued as if nothing had happened, as if the floor had not just opened beneath me. When Daniel came home that evening, I was sitting in the same chair. I had not moved much. I had not called anyone. I had simply sat with the letter on the table in front of me, turning over the same question again and again. Was it possible? Was any of it possible? I showed him the letter without saying a word. I watched his face. He picked it up. He read it. And here is what I will never forget, what I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He didn't look confused. He didn't look grieved or shocked, or even particularly surprised. His expression did something else entirely. A flicker, fast as a blink, like a man who has just been told that a problem he thought was contained had started to leak. He controlled it within a second. He looked up at me with careful, practiced concern. "Mara," he said, "someone is playing a sick game with you." His voice was steady. His eyes were steady. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. But his hand was cold. And I realized, sitting there in our warm kitchen in our good enough life, that I had never, in 11 years of marriage, noticed how cold his hands always were. I didn't sleep that night. Daniel went to bed at his usual time. 10:30, after the news, after brushing his teeth for exactly 2 minutes the way he always did. I listened to the sounds of our routine like they belonged to someone else's life. Water, running, the creak of the mattress. Within 20 minutes, his breathing slowed and steadied. I lay beside him in the dark and stared at the ceiling and took stock. If the letter was real, and some part of me, the part that had never fully accepted the word presumed, believed that it was, then Claire was alive. My sister had been alive for 5 years while I grieved her. She had been alive while I stood at her memorial in Washington and held a photograph and wept in front of people who brought casseroles and said she's at peace now. She had been alive while Daniel held my hand and drove me home and made me tea and let me cry on his shoulder. He knows. What did he know? How long had he known it? Why had he said nothing? I turned those questions over slowly, carefully, the way you handle something that might cut you. And as I lay there, the image of his face when he read the letter, that flicker, that split-second leak of something that was not surprise, began to mean more and more. You learn a person's face in 11 years of marriage. You learn their tells. Daniel was a controlled man, not cold exactly, but measured. He did not rattle easily, which meant that flicker had cost him something. It had slipped through his control because he had not had time to prepare for it. He had not expected the letter, but he had not been surprised by its contents. I thought about the weeks after Claire disappeared. I thought about how Daniel had handled the logistics, contacting the Park Service, communicating with the local sheriff's office, managing the paperwork for the death certificate. I had been too destroyed to do any of it myself. I had handed him everything, grateful and gutted, and he had taken care of it all. I had called that love. I had called it partnership. Now I lay in the dark and called it something else. By 3 a.m, I had cried twice, silently, in the bathroom with the fan running. By 4, the crying had stopped, and something colder had taken its place. Not anger. Anger felt too hot, too dangerous. What I felt was closer to clarity, the kind that comes after fever breaks, painful and clean. What did I actually have? One letter. Handwriting I believed was Claire's but couldn't prove. No return address. No way to contact her directly. A postmark from Portland, and a husband who had given me one sentence. Someone is playing a sick game, and then gone to sleep. If I confronted Daniel directly, he would deny it. He would be calm and kind and concerned, and he would suggest a therapist. He would reframe the letter as someone cruel exploiting my grief. He would do it so well that I might start to believe him. I knew this about him. His greatest skill was not lying exactly, but redirecting. He never said the false thing outright. He simply turned you away from the true thing so gently you thanked him for it afterward. So I could not confront him. Not yet. Not without something solid. I needed to think like someone who had something to lose. Because I did. If I was wrong, I was a grieving woman who had accused her husband of a monstrous thing. I would lose my marriage, possibly my reputation, certainly my peace. If I was right, the stakes were even higher. A man who had hidden his wife's living sister for 5 years was not a man who would respond to confrontation with honesty. He would respond with strategy. I had to be smarter. I had to be quieter. By the time gray light started showing around the curtains, I had the outline of a plan. First, preserve the evidence. I photographed the letter and envelope on my phone and emailed the photos to an address Daniel didn't know about. An old college account I hadn't used in years. I put the physical letter in a Ziploc bag and hid it inside a box of winter clothes in the back of the guest room closet behind the suitcases. Daniel had no reason to go there. Second, verify the handwriting. I knew Claire's handwriting was on old birthday cards somewhere in the house. I would find them without making it obvious I was looking. Third, Portland. Someone had mailed that letter from Portland. Claire, if it was Claire, had been there as recently as yesterday. She hadn't included a return address deliberately, which meant she was frightened. But she had sent it. She had taken the risk. That meant she wanted contact. I needed to find a way to make contact without Daniel knowing. I got up, washed my face, and put the coffee on. When Daniel came downstairs at 7, I handed him a mug and kissed him on the cheek the way I always did. He looked at me with something careful in his eyes. Checking, I now understood. And I gave him the most ordinary smile I owned. You don't know what I know, I thought, watching him stir his coffee. And then I corrected myself. You don't know what I'm going to find out. I took a personal day from school on Friday. I told Daniel I still didn't feel well, which was true enough, though not in the way he understood. I waited until his truck pulled out of the driveway, watched it turn the corner, and then I gave it another 10 minutes before I moved. I had learned, in the last 48 hours, to be careful about the difference between gone and gone enough. The cards were in a shoebox in the bedroom closet on the high shelf, behind my college yearbooks. I had not opened that box in at least 2 years. Inside, birthday cards going back to my teens, postcards from friends who had moved away, a few notes in my mother's handwriting. And there, near the bottom, 3 cards from Claire. A birthday card from the year she turned 26. A Christmas card from 2 years before she disappeared. A note she'd written me after our mother's surgery. Just a folded piece of paper, not even an envelope, that said, "You were so brave today. Love you, C." I spread them on the kitchen table next to the letter. I am not a handwriting expert, but I am a person who had read Claire's handwriting for 30 years, who had received notes passed in church pews and grocery lists, texted as photos and post-its left on my refrigerator door. The letter matched, not just the general style, the specific way she formed her lowercase a, slightly open at the top, the way her T crossings slanted very slightly upward, the particular loop of her Y. It was her. My hand was shaking when I put the cards away. I drove 40 minutes to Bridgeport to a private investigator named Walt Gruber, whose name had come up when I'd searched. Carefully, in an incognito browser, on my school laptop, which Daniel had never touched, for licensed investigators in Connecticut with experience in domestic cases. His office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building that also housed an insurance agency and a tax preparer. Ordinary, anonymous. Exactly what I needed. Walt Gruber was in his late 50s, heavy-set, with the mild, unhurried manner of someone who had heard most things and been surprised by very few of them. I sat across from his desk and told him everything. The letter, the handwriting, the death 5 years ago that was never fully resolved. My husband's reaction. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You want to know 2 things," he said finally. "Whether your sister is alive and what your husband's connection to it is." "Yes, those might turn out to be the same investigation," he said. "Or they might not. We start with what's verifiable." He looked at the photographs I'd sent him from my email, the letter and envelope enlarged on his monitor. "Portland postmark. That's a starting point. You have any idea whether your sister had connections there? Friends? A job? Anything?" I thought. Claire had lived in Seattle for 2 years in her mid-20s. Portland wasn't far. She'd mentioned friends there, a woman named Deanna she'd done a ceramics workshop with once. I told him this. "It's thin," he said, "but it's something." He quoted me a retainer. It was more than I had easy access to without Daniel noticing, which meant I needed to move money carefully. I had a small savings account from before the marriage, never fully folded into our joint finances. A laziness on both our parts that now felt like providence. I wrote Walt a check from it. Walking back to my car, I felt the strange, specific vertigo of having done something that could not be undone. This was no longer just a letter on a kitchen table. There was now a professional looking into my husband's life. There was a paper trail, slim as it was. There was a direction. I was halfway home when my phone rang. Daniel. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice even. "What's up?" "Just checking in. How are you feeling?" "Better," I said. "I've been resting." A pause. Small, probably meaningless to anyone who didn't know him. "Good," he said. "I'll be home by 6. I'll pick up dinner." "That sounds great." I hung up and gripped the steering wheel and asked myself the question I hadn't let myself fully ask yet. What kind of man hides the fact that his wife's sister is alive? The answer came back quiet and certain. A man who has a reason to. 3 days later, Walt called me on the prepaid phone I had bought at a gas station in Milford, paying cash. I was in the school parking lot during my free period, windows up, heat running. "I found her," he said. My throat closed. "Claire?" A woman matching her description has been living in Portland under the name Ellen Marsh for approximately 4 years. Waitress at a diner in the Alberta Arts District. No digital footprint to speak of before that. "I have a photo." He texted it to the prepaid phone. I opened it with hands that weren't entirely steady. It was Claire. Older, thinner, her hair a different color. A flat, dark brown instead of the warm blonde I remembered. She was carrying a tray, caught mid-turn, not looking at the camera. But it was her face. Her jaw, her posture, the particular way she held her shoulders slightly forward. She was alive. And if Claire was alive, then Daniel had known it. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after. The bell rang. Students moved across the lot. Life continued in all its ordinary motion. I thought, there is no version of this where I walk it back now. The lawyer's name was Patricia Howe, and she came recommended by Walt Gruber as someone who handled high-conflict divorce with the same quiet efficiency that a surgeon brings to a difficult procedure. Her office was in New Haven, clean and spare, with diplomas on the wall and a box of tissues on the corner of the desk that somehow didn't feel condescending. I laid out everything. The letter, Walt's findings, the handwriting comparison, the savings account, the marital assets, the mortgage, the business. I told her about the death certificate, presumed death, and what it would mean if Claire was alive and Daniel had known. Patricia took notes in a small, precise hand and did not react to any of it emotionally, which was exactly what I needed. If your husband had knowledge that your sister was alive and concealed it from you, she said, we're potentially looking at fraud relating to the death certificate process, possibly obstruction, and certainly a significant factor in the divorce proceedings. None of that is your burden to prove criminally. That's for law enforcement. Your burden is civil. When does he find out? I asked. When you file, she said, not before. I filed on a Thursday. Daniel found out on a Friday afternoon when the process server met him at his job site in Norwalk. I was at school when it happened, standing in front of a class of 8th graders discussing The Outsiders, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the moment my marriage formally ended, I was talking about loyalty and belonging and the boys who never got a fair chance. He called 6 times before I left the building. I let all 6 go to voicemail. By the time I got to my car, there was a text. We need to talk. Tonight. Please. I drove to Patricia's paralegal's home. She had offered her spare room, and I had accepted. And I did not go back to the house on Ashford. He showed up anyway. I was in the living room with Patricia's paralegal, a quiet woman named Serena, when the headlights swept across the front window at 8:30. I knew it was his truck before I heard the engine. Daniel knocked on the door with the controlled knock of a man who is angry but performing calm. When Serena opened it, he looked past her at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Stripped of its usual management, raw in a way that was more frightening than tears would have been. You want to do this? He said quietly. I've already done it, I said. You don't know what you're getting into. He said it softly, which was worse than if he'd shouted. There are things that are complicated, things you don't understand yet. If you talk to the police about any of this, you'll regret it. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you the truth. I'm not threatening you. That sentence, the way it sat in the room after he said it. You should go, Daniel, Serena said, and she had her phone in her hand with the screen on. He looked at me for another long moment. I held his gaze and said nothing, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not fear, though fear was there, underneath. What I felt on the surface was a kind of stillness. The stillness of a person who has already crossed the river and burned the bridge and has nothing left to protect on the other bank. He left. I called Walt from the prepaid phone that night and told him what had happened. He advised me to document the visit, time, date, exact words as best I could remember, and send it to Patricia. I did. He also told me to be careful in the next few weeks, that men in Daniel's position sometimes escalated, sometimes retreated, and it was hard to know which before it happened. I called in sick the following Monday and Tuesday, not because I was afraid exactly, though I was watchful, but because I was exhausted in a way that went below the body. I stayed at Serena's, and I slept a great deal, and I watched old movies, and I let myself be still for the first time since October. I had been running on adrenaline and precision for 3 weeks. I needed 2 days to remember I was a human being. On Wednesday morning, I woke up at 6, made coffee, and sat at Serena's kitchen table in the quiet. I thought about Claire, living in Portland under a name that wasn't hers, carrying trays in a diner, 4 years of that. I thought about what she must have been afraid of, to stay gone so long. I thought about the specific courage it had taken to pick up a pen and write those 7 words and mail them to me anyway. She came back for me, I thought. Now I have to be worth coming back to. Daniel's first attempt at negotiation came through a mutual friend. Gary Speaks had been Daniel's college roommate, and by extension, someone I had known for the length of my marriage. Barbecues, holiday parties, the casual accumulated intimacy of a shared social circle. He called me on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after I'd filed. and his tone was the careful tone of a man who had been briefed. "Mara, I just want you to know that Daniel is really struggling," Gary said. "He wants you to know he's willing to talk, to explain. He says there are things about Claire's situation that are more complicated than they look." More complicated than they look. I wrote that phrase down on a notepad after I hung up because I thought Patricia should hear it. "He's using a back channel," she said when I told her. "That's fine. It doesn't mean Gary is complicit. He's probably just being a loyal friend. But document it." Daniel's second attempt was more direct. A letter. Actual paper sent to the school, which was still my official address. It was 3 pages long, handwritten, which surprised me. Daniel was not a handwritten letter man. He was a text, a call, a practical communicator. 3 handwritten pages meant he had tried to think carefully about this. I read it twice. The letter did not deny that he knew Claire was alive. Read closely, it never directly addressed the question at all. A characteristic evasion. What it offered instead was a framework. Things are not what they seem. I was protecting you. If you would just let me explain in person, what you're doing will hurt people who don't deserve it. That last phrase snagged on something. People who don't deserve it. Who else was involved? Who was he protecting besides himself? I did not respond to the letter. What I noticed in those quiet weeks was that I felt better than I expected to. The anxiety that had coiled in my chest since October had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. From shapeless dread to something with edges, something I could see and account for. There is a particular relief in knowing the name of the thing that has been frightening you. I was afraid of a specific situation now, not a vague one. That was manageable. I also noticed I was eating again, sleeping in longer stretches, finding the occasional moment of something close to ordinary pleasure. A good cup of coffee, a student's essay that surprised me, the way November light came through the windows in my classroom in the late afternoon. The support came from unexpected directions. My colleague Beth, who taught 7th grade science and had always been friendly but never particularly close to me, knocked on my classroom door one afternoon and asked if I wanted to get dinner. Someone at the school had clearly mentioned the separation, small towns, small schools. But Beth asked no questions. She talked about her own divorce 7 years prior with the particular frankness of someone who had been through something real and come out with their sense of humor intact. By the end of the evening, I had laughed twice, genuinely, for the first time in weeks. My friend from graduate school, Kim, drove up from New York on a Saturday. She sat in Serena's living room and listened to the full story without flinching and said, at the end of it, "You are being extraordinarily sane about this." "I don't feel sane," I said. "That's how you know you actually are," she said. Walt called mid-November with an update. He had made contact with Claire through a mutual connection, carefully, discreetly, leaving no digital trace. She had not yet agreed to speak with me directly. She was frightened, Walt said. But she had not refused. "She knows you filed," Walt said. "She knows you're not backing down. That matters to her." I thought about Claire in her diner in Portland, living under a borrowed name, watching from a distance. I thought about what it must mean to her to see that I was fighting without even fully knowing what I was fighting for yet. "Tell her I'm here," I said, "when she's ready." That evening, I sat alone in Serena's spare room and looked at the photo Walt had sent me. Claire with the dark hair carrying the tray. And I made myself a quiet promise. Whatever Daniel had done, whatever shape the whole truth turned out to be, I was going to stand in it without flinching. I had learned in the last month that I was capable of that. It was not a small thing to learn. They came on a Sunday. I should have anticipated it. The Sunday visit, the performance of reasonableness, the chosen day that implies leisure and goodwill. Daniel was there, and beside him was a woman I had met perhaps 5 or 6 times over the years, his older sister, Renata. She was a real estate attorney in Fairfield County, sharp and well-dressed, and she had always looked at me the way certain people look at a room they are calculating the square footage of. I agreed to the meeting in a coffee shop in Milford. Public, recorded on my phone in my coat pocket, locations sent to Patricia in advance. I was not willing to be alone with them in a private space. They accepted these terms without comment, which told me they had already decided how the conversation would go, regardless of setting. Renata chose a corner table, which I noticed. She wanted walls on 2 sides and a clear view of the door. Old habits. Daniel looked thinner. He had the careful, prepared appearance of someone who had rehearsed. Renata ordered a black coffee and put both hands on the table and looked at me with an expression of measured sympathy that did not reach her eyes. "We wanted to come to you in good faith," she said. "Daniel has been in tremendous pain. You've been in tremendous pain. None of this has to continue." "Tell me what this is," I said, "in your understanding." Renata's expression didn't change. "A misunderstanding that has been blown significantly out of proportion. My sister being alive for 5 years and my husband knowing about it is a misunderstanding." A pause, carefully managed. "The situation with Claire," Renata said, "is genuinely complicated. There were reasons, serious reasons, why her disappearance was handled the way it was. Reasons that involved her safety, her specific choices, and matters that were, frankly, none of Daniel's making. Then let Claire explain them to me herself." "Claire is—" Renata glanced at Daniel. "Claire is not in a position to have that conversation right now." "Because she's frightened," I said. "Of what exactly, or of whom?" The temperature at the table shifted. It was Daniel who spoke next, quietly, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, and his voice had the specific softness of someone saying something they want you to understand is final. "Mara, if you continue with this, the investigation, the lawyer, all of it, you are going to uncover things that are going to hurt you. Not because I want to hurt you, because the truth of what happened is more painful than what you're imagining. I'm asking you, as someone who has loved you for 11 years, to let this go." I looked at him. I took my time. I looked at the man who had held my hand at my sister's memorial, who had made me tea on the worst nights, who had learned exactly which version of tenderness I was most likely to believe. And I thought about how long it must have taken him to build that fluency, that precise, practiced knowledge of what I needed to hear. That was not nothing. It was, in its way, a kind of terrible expertise. I thought about what it means to be asked by a person who has deceived you to trust them one more time, to let the deception stand for your own protection. "You're asking me," I said, "to accept a version of events that you constructed, for my own sake." "Yes." "And Claire," I said, "what does she get?" Neither of them answered. The silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. "She stays in Portland," I said, "living under a fake name, alone, for whatever reason you've decided is sufficient. And I stay here, in the version of my life that you built for me. And we all just continue." "Mara—" "No." I said it flatly, without heat. "No, I don't accept that." Renata's composure shifted. The first genuine crack I had seen. "You are making an enormous mistake," she said, and her voice had dropped to something harder. "You think this investigation is going to give you clarity, but what it's actually going to give you is a legal situation that is much more complicated than a divorce. There are things in Daniel's business history, things that were never yours to be exposed to, that will become yours if you keep pushing. Do you understand what I'm saying? I understand that you're threatening me with information you seem to think I should be afraid of, I said, which tells me you don't know me as well as you think you do. Daniel pushed back from the table. For just a moment, a split second, like the flicker when he'd read the letter. He was unguarded, and what I saw in his face was not anger, not even frustration. It was something more like helplessness. A man watching a plan fail in real time. A man who had spent years managing outcomes and was encountering, perhaps for the first time, something that would not be managed. They left without ordering anything other than Renata's coffee. I sat alone in that coffee shop for 15 minutes after they were gone. The waitress refilled my water glass and asked if I needed anything else, and I said no thank you, in a voice that sounded entirely normal, which struck me as remarkable given what was happening in my chest. I noted the specific quality of the fear I felt, and I did feel it. I will not pretend otherwise. The reference to business history was not an empty threat, and I understood from Patricia that whatever was in Daniel's contracting records could, in certain configurations, have implications I wasn't fully prepared for. But I also noticed something else. The fear didn't loosen my grip. It tightened it. I thought of Claire in Portland, not running toward anything, just running from this. From people who decided what was best for her and built a world around that decision without asking her consent. Who had she been allowed to consult? Who had asked her what she wanted? The answer was no one. I thought, the opposite of their offer is what I have to do. I texted Patricia from the parking lot. They met with me, recorded. Renata referenced business history as a threat. We need to talk tomorrow. Then I drove back to Serena's in the gray November afternoon and made tea and sat with the fear until it settled into something I recognized. Fuel. Claire called me on a Tuesday morning in early December. I was in my classroom before school, the lights still half up, the heat just starting to take the edge off the morning cold. The prepaid phone buzzed on my desk, and I looked at the number, unknown, Oregon area code. And my hands went completely still. Mara, her voice. 5 years older, quieter, with a carefulness in it that the old Claire hadn't had. But her voice. I couldn't speak for a moment. I pressed my hand flat on the desk to feel something solid. I'm here, I finally said. Claire, I'm here. We talked for 40 minutes. I let her lead. What she told me came in pieces, not entirely linear. The narrative of someone who had carried something alone for a long time and was now setting it down carefully, testing each word before she committed to it. The short version, the version I could bear to hold in that cold classroom with the morning light coming through the windows. Claire had discovered, 3 months before her disappearance, that Daniel's contracting business was being used to move money for a man named Gregor Vasile, a property developer with connections to organized crime, primarily in New York and New Jersey. She had found out by accident. She'd been visiting me for a weekend and had seen documents on Daniel's desk she wasn't meant to see. She had confronted Daniel privately, without telling me. Daniel had not hurt her, but he had made clear with enough specificity to be convincing that Vasile's people would. He had told her that disappearing was the only safe option for her and for me. That if she stayed and talked, we would both be at risk. He set it up, Claire said. The trail, the jacket on the ridge, the car at the trailhead. He helped me disappear. And then he watched you grieve me for 5 years. The silence after that lasted a long time. Outside my classroom window, a school bus was pulling into the lot. Everything was perfectly ordinary. Everything was completely destroyed. Why the letter now? I asked. Why did you write to me now? Because I heard from someone that Daniel was having problems in the business, she said. Old things coming up. I thought if things were falling apart for him, maybe there was finally a chance. Maybe the leverage he had over me was loosening. A pause. And because I couldn't stand another year. Mara, I couldn't stand it. I told her about Patricia, about the divorce filing, about Walt. I told her what Renata had said about business history. Claire was quiet for a moment. He's scared, she said. If he's playing that card, he's scared of what you have. What do I have? More than you know, she said. Walt. Does he know about Vasile? Not yet. He needs to. I called Walt before first period. I called Patricia between second and third. By noon, the picture had begun to clarify in the way that pictures do when you finally get enough pieces on the table. Not all at once, but irreversibly. Like watching a photograph develop in a darkroom, the shapes emerging one by one until the image is undeniable. Vasile's name was already known to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, as it turned out. Walt had contacts. Patricia had colleagues. Things moved in the 3 weeks that followed with a speed that surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Some cases are already waiting for one more piece of evidence before they tip, balanced on a fulcrum that has been there all along, invisible, patient. The deposition was on a Monday. Daniel arrived with his attorney looking like a man who had prepared thoroughly and whose preparations had, at the last moment, turned out to be for the wrong exam. His suit was pressed. His shoes were polished. He had brought a legal pad and 2 pens, and he set them on the table with the precision of a man who believes that orderliness communicates competence. Patricia had coordinated with the federal investigators, carefully within the bounds of the civil case. And what Daniel did not know, sitting down across that conference room table, was that the questions were not going to be about the divorce assets. They were going to be about wire transfers, about a property development company in Newark, about a Shell LLC registered in Delaware with Daniel's signature on the formation documents, about a man named Gregor Vasile. I watched Daniel's face when the first question landed, the careful management, the version of his face I had lived with for 11 years, held for approximately 30 seconds. Then it began to come apart, not dramatically, not in a way that made the room loud. It was quieter than that, more final. The expression of a man who understands, for the first time without the ability to deny it, that what he built is finished. I had seen that expression once before, briefly, barely. The night he came to Serena's door and said, "You don't know what you're getting into." But this was different. That night he had still believed he could redirect me. Today there was nowhere to redirect anything. He looked at me once, briefly, across the table. Just once. I held his gaze. I thought about Claire on the ridge, leaving her jacket on a branch. I thought about 4 years of a false name and a diner in Portland. I thought about Daniel taking my hand at the memorial service and the coffee going cold on the kitchen table in October, and the 11 years I had spent in a house with a man I did not fully know. I thought about all the moments I had mistaken control for care. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction. What I felt was something quieter and harder to name, the specific gravity of a truth that has finally been allowed to land. His attorney asked for a recess. Daniel did not look at me again. The federal investigation moved on its own momentum after that, largely outside my involvement. What I knew came from Patricia and from the news, and later from the formal proceedings I chose to attend. Daniel cooperated. This surprised almost no one who knew him well. He was, at his core, a practical man, and when the practical calculation shifted, so did he. He provided testimony about Vasile's operation in exchange for a reduced charge, pleading to 2 counts of financial fraud rather than the full indictment. which had included money laundering and accessory charges that carried significantly longer sentences. He received 36 months and was ordered to forfeit his business assets and a substantial portion of the personal accounts. The contracting business, the one he had built over 15 years, the one whose logo was on the side of his truck, the one whose reputation in Fairfield County he had been quietly proud of, was dissolved. Its bank accounts were frozen, then emptied by court order. The company existed for a few more weeks as a legal entity on paper, and then it didn't. Renata was separately investigated for her role in structuring certain property transactions. She had been careful. She was, after all, an attorney who understood documentation. But not careful enough. She was not charged criminally, but her law license was suspended pending review, and she resigned from her firm before the review concluded. The resignation letter, which somehow found its way into the local legal community's ambient gossip, was said to be dignified and brief. That sounded right to me. Renata had always known when a room was lost. Gregor Vasile was arrested in March. His case was still ongoing when I stopped following it. I made a deliberate choice to stop following it. The outcome of Vasile's case was not going to change what had happened to my family, and I had learned to be careful about what I let live rent-free in my attention. The civil divorce was final in the spring. Patricia negotiated hard on the marital home. The contracting business having been forfeited, the remaining assets were the house, 2 vehicles, and the joint accounts. I kept the house, which I had not been certain I wanted, but which felt important as a matter of principle. I could always sell it later. What mattered was that no one handed me a reduced settlement and called it fairness. Patricia had said, early on, "You are not here to be accommodated. You are here to be made whole." I had written that down. I came back to it on the hard days. I did not have to be in the same room as Daniel again after the deposition, which was one of the cleaner mercies of the whole process. There were moments in the weeks that followed when I would find myself unexpectedly reconstructing some ordinary memory. Sunday mornings, the dog at our feet, the crossword puzzle folded in quarters. And I would have to sit with the complicated grief of that. Not grief for him, exactly. Grief for the version of the life I had believed I was living. Those two things were not the same. I was careful to know the difference. Claire came to Connecticut in April. She drove, which she said felt important, that she needed to feel the distance closing in real time, mile by mile, state by state, the way you can't feel it from a plane. She arrived on a Thursday evening, and I was standing on the front porch of the house in Ashford when her rental car turned onto the street. The light was that particular April gold that Connecticut does well, the kind that makes everything look like it's been forgiven. She parked at the curb and got out, and she was older and thinner, and her hair was still that flat, dark brown, and she stood on the sidewalk looking at the house with an expression I recognized from my own mirror. The particular look of someone encountering a place that belongs to a version of themselves they are not sure they can reclaim. I walked down to the sidewalk and I held my sister for a long time. Neither of us said anything for a while. There was nothing efficient enough to say. Some moments resist language. You simply have to be inside them until they're finished. Later, sitting in the kitchen with takeout containers on the table and the dog asleep on Claire's feet, Pepper, who had apparently decided without deliberation that Claire was to be trusted. We talked for 5 hours, not about Daniel or the legal case or Portland, about everything else, about our mother, who had died 2 years into Claire's disappearance and never knew her daughter was alive, which was a grief we were going to be sorting out for a long time, about Claire's life in Portland, what had been hard and what had been, against all expectation, occasionally good, about what she wanted now. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need time to want things again." "You have time," I said. The dog shifted and sighed on her feet. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the April dark was soft. This was not a tidy ending. I want to be clear about that. There were things that would not be resolved, people who had been hurt in ways that wouldn't fully heal, and a particular kind of structural damage that Claire and I would be repairing for years. Grief doesn't simply reassemble itself when its object is restored. My mother would still be gone. The 5 years would still have happened. There was no mechanism for retrieving them. But Daniel was facing federal prison. Renata had lost her license. Vasile was in custody. The machine they had built, the one that had required Claire's disappearance as a precondition of its operation, was dismantled, piece by people doing their jobs and by one woman who had refused, on a cold October morning at the end of a driveway, to accept the comfortable explanation. And my sister was sitting at my kitchen table. It was not a small thing to have. It was, in fact, everything. The following year was the first one in a long time that felt like mine. I kept the house in Ashford through the winter and sold it in the spring. Not because I needed to, but because I was ready to. I bought a smaller place in a town on the Connecticut shore. A 2-bedroom with a porch that faced the water, close enough to commute to school. It needed work, which I mostly did myself on weekends, learning things I had always meant to learn. Patching plaster, stripping paint, understanding why water finds the places you haven't sealed. There is a particular satisfaction in repairing something with your own hands. I had not known that before. I was promoted to department head in September, which came with a modest raise and a great deal more paperwork and, unexpectedly, a sense of purpose I hadn't known I was missing. I liked being the person younger teachers came to with their problems. I was good at listening. I had, after all, spent the last year developing an uncommon tolerance for sitting with difficult truths. Beth and I had dinner regularly, every other Thursday, a rotating set of restaurants in the area. Kim visited from New York twice and stayed in the guest room, which now had actual curtains and a bedside table. I began swimming at the public pool in the mornings, 3 times a week, which I had always intended to do and never had. Small things, all of them. But the small things were what made a life, I had decided. The crossword puzzle and the farmer's market coffee. These things had not failed me, only the person I had shared them with. Claire did not move to Connecticut, not right away. She stayed in Portland through the winter, which I understood. She needed to walk out of that life at her own pace. She had a therapist there, a community of people who knew her as Ellen Marsh and accepted the explanation that Ellen Marsh had decided to become herself again. In the spring, she applied to a graduate program in social work at Portland State, which surprised me, and then, on reflection, surprised me not at all. She was going to help people navigate the kind of situations that couldn't be neatly resolved. She was, it turned out, exactly suited for it. We talked every Sunday. Actual phone calls, not texts, with time set aside. We talked about everything. Our mother, our childhood, the things we had never said when we thought we had all the time in the world. Claire cried sometimes. I cried sometimes. The calls routinely lasted longer than either of us planned. "Is it strange," she asked me once, "that I feel like I got a second chance at something I didn't know I'd lost?" "No," I said. "I feel the same way." Daniel was serving his sentence at a federal correctional facility in New Hampshire. I knew this the way I knew certain other facts: that my car needed an oil change, that my property taxes were due in January. Practically, without emotional weight. He had asked, through his attorney, whether I would accept a letter from him. I had said no. not from cruelty. Simply because there was nothing he could offer me in a letter that I needed, and I was learning finally to measure what I gave my attention to. Renata's license remained suspended. She had taken a position doing compliance consulting, the kind of work that has no business cards and is conducted largely by phone. I heard this through the ambient intelligence of mutual acquaintances. I did not seek the information out, and I did not dwell on it when it arrived. Gregor Vasile was convicted in November on 11 counts. His sentencing was covered in the state news. I read the article, set it aside, and went back to the plaster I'd been patching in the hallway. Was I happy? That question used to feel too large to answer honestly. Now it felt answerable. Not because everything was resolved. It wasn't. But because I had stopped waiting for resolution as a precondition of happiness. I had a sister who called me on Sundays. I had students who surprised me. I had a porch facing the water. I had a dog who had forgiven me the upheaval of the last 2 years with a cheerful completeness I found instructive. I had my own life, recognizably mine, built by my own choices. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, I understood now, everything I had actually needed from the beginning, and had simply, for 11 years, been looking for in the wrong place. That's the story I've been carrying. I've told it now because I think some of you may be carrying something like it. A letter you can't explain, a face that flickered at the wrong moment, a handwriting you recognize when you should have nothing left to recognize. If that's you, trust the thing you know, not the comfortable explanation, the thing you know. I learned that the most dangerous prison is the one someone else builds around your grief, and the bravest thing I ever did was refuse to stay in it. What would you have done that October morning, holding that letter in your bathrobe at the end of the driveway? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, stay. There's more to tell. Thank you for listening.